5:14. It was a cold, crisp morning in December 1974 at Columbus Airport in Ohio. TWA Flight 514 had just arrived from Indianapolis. From here, it would take 85 passengers and 7 crew members to Washington National Airport in Washington, D.C. On this day, the plane was under the command of Captain Richard Brock. Brock was 44 years old and had been captaining the 727 for 3 years. In that time, he had accumulated just under 3,000 hours on the aircraft. He had an excellent training and performance record, with no apparent weaknesses in either his technical knowledge or his practical flying skills. Sitting to Brock's right on that cold December morning was 40-year-old First Officer Leonard Kessick. Kessick had just over 1,000 hours on the 727 and more than 6,000 hours in total. Like the captain, his training and performance record was impeccable. Joining the two pilots on the flight deck was 31-year-old flight engineer Thomas Safranek. With just over 100 hours on the 727, Safranek was the least experienced crew member on board, but he had over 3,000 hours as a flight engineer on other aircraft. By all accounts, the passengers could not have been in safer hands. On this day, as the pilots prepared the aircraft for the short trip to Washington, D.C., the 4 cabin crew members completed their pre-flight checks, making sure that each of the 86 passengers on board was seated and fastened their seat belts. Today, the Boeing 727 is an antique aircraft. There are none left in passenger service, and only a few governments and militaries use them. But in 1974, the 727 was at the cutting edge of aircraft design and avionics. Nearly 2,000 were sold and formed a significant part of many airlines' short-haul fleets. The one in service that day was still quite new at just 4 years old, but even at that young age, it was still. That morning, Flight 514 was ready to depart Columbus. The journey to Washington would take just over an hour. The aircraft was carrying 13 tons of fuel, more than enough to reach the destination and then go back again without refueling. The pilot started the 3 engines, and Captain Brock began taxiing the 727 out to the runway. So far, everything was going to plan, but it wouldn't be long before the plan started to fall apart. At 10:25 that morning, Captain Brock powered the 727 into the cold December sky. As the passengers settled in for the hour-long trip, the captain turned the aircraft southeast toward the nation's capital. But Washington, D.C. was not about to give the flight a warm welcome. The winds were howling across the active runway, reaching speeds of up to 49 knots, or 90 kilometers per hour. This was significantly beyond the Boeing 727's crosswind capabilities. Inbound flights were diverting or being made to enter holding patterns, and aircraft on the ground were being delayed. It was not the easy day of flying that the 3 flight crew had hoped for, and now things were about to get worse. Just 12 minutes into the flight, while they were still climbing to their cruising altitude, the crew received bad news. Due to the strong crosswinds, Washington National Airport was now closed to all arrivals. Captain Brock had no choice. He had to divert. 36 kilometers to the west of Washington National lay Washington's other major airport, Dulles. As it happened, the conditions at Dulles weren't much better. There was low cloud, high winds, and snow, but at least for now, they were accepting arrivals. This would be where the captain would take the aircraft. For many of the passengers on board, this unplanned disruption to their journey was just an inconvenience, but it would significantly increase the workload for the flight crew. This last-minute change in destination in what was already a short sector meant that time was now against them to prepare for the approach into Dulles. On these short flights, pilots often have their approach charts ready for the expected runway at the destination. Sometimes they even brief the arrival while on the ground at the departure airport. Now the crew had to mentally detach themselves from their planned destination, Washington National, and immediately begin preparing for an approach to the much less familiar Dulles Airport. This rapid change of plan was the first in a series of events that would lead to the unraveling of Flight 514. When the pilots reached cruising altitude, they began searching for the approach charts to Dulles Airport. As they did so, the captain radioed TWA operations in New York, informing them that they would be diverting to Washington Dulles. The airline would now have to deal with 85 frustrated passengers when they landed. Captain Brock informed the passengers of the diversion and then handed over the controls to First Officer Kessick. Brock had to familiarize himself with the approach and landing charts. It had been a long time since he had been at the airport, and he would only have a few minutes to understand how approaches were made there before he had to make one himself. At this point, the controller cleared Flight 514 to descend to 23,000 feet. Two phrases are drilled into every student pilot at the start of their training. The first is a list of priorities: fly, navigate, communicate. This means that a pilot's first priority at all times is to maintain control of the aircraft, to fly. Navigate means that the pilot must also have a clear understanding of where he is and how high he is above the terrain. Only when these two tasks have been accomplished can the final priority of communicating with the air traffic control be considered. But what happens when communication leads to a breach of the other two maxims? In a few moments, we'll see why the story of TWA Flight 514 is so instructive when it comes to this vital aspect of flying. The second maxim taught to all pilots during their training is, when in doubt, leave no doubt. In the minutes to come, an unfortunate combination of doubt and miscommunication would endanger the lives of everyone on board Flight 514. As the flight descended, the captain discussed the approach with Dulles Air Traffic Control. The plan was to approach the airport from the west via a radio beacon called Front Royal. From there, they would continue east until they intercepted the final approach track for runway 12. This final track was based on another radio beacon called Armel. It was a straightforward approach. Really, all the pilots had to do was tune their navigation radios to Front Royal and Armel and follow their respective needles until they lined up with the runway. After receiving this clearance from air traffic control, the pilots checked the standard arrival charts at Dulles, known as approach plates. In addition to course and distance information, the approach plates contain vital information about the lowest altitude at which the aircraft can fly along a given course. This is known as the sector safe altitude, or the altitude that is safe for that particular sector of airspace. When flying in the clouds, a pilot literally entrusts the lives of his passengers and crew to the information contained in the details annotated on these charts. This is a copy of the chart used by the crew of Flight 514. It shows that between Front Royal and Round Hill, where the pilots were cleared to go, the minimum safe altitude was 3,400 feet. As long as they stayed above that altitude, they would be safe. Once they reached Round Hill, known as the first approach fix, they could continue to descend to an altitude of 1,800 feet, 11.6 meters. After reaching Round Hill, the final approach fix was just 6 miles from the airport. This section of the chart shows a side view of the approach, including the 6-meter final approach fix. From here, as this section of the chart shows, the pilots would be able to descend from 1,800 feet towards runway 12. As the crew of Flight 514 studied these charts, they formed a mental picture of the lateral and vertical position of the aircraft as it approached Dulles. So far, they were flying, navigating, and communicating, but that began to change when air traffic control radioed the flight with a new clearance. At 10 minutes to 11 that morning, Washington Air Traffic Control cleared Flight 514 to turn left on a heading of 090 and intercept the 300-degree radial from the ARML beacon. This line here is the 300-degree radial from the ARML beacon. It is a line that is 300 degrees from the beacon on the compass rose, which is roughly northwest. 360 degrees is north and 270 degrees is west. The reciprocal of 300 degrees is 120 degrees. So this is the heading that the pilot selected in their navigation equipment. The controller's clearance to turn to 090 was a shortcut for the flight. While this was nice, given that the pilots were already on a diversion, it presented its own problem. The aircraft was no longer following the route specified on the approach board. The crew had effectively gone off the beaten track. You might think that being off the beaten track would have worried the crew of Flight 514. After all, the Boeing 727 had none of the advanced systems that today's aircraft have to show pilots the surrounding terrain on large, colorful navigation displays like this one. All they had to rely on were their paper charts, direction indicators, and rangefinders. But at least for the moment, being off the beaten track shouldn't have mattered too much. The controller had just cleared the flight to descend to 8,000 feet, well above the minimum safe altitude for the area. The flight engineer read the approach checklist and calculated the aircraft's final approach and landing speeds. The crew worked together, discussing items on the instrument approach chart, including the round hill intersection, the final approach fix, and also the visual approach slope indicator and runway lights. They also studied the airport diagram, which they would need to use to find their way to the gate after landing. All was well as the aircraft continued its descent. At just after 11 o'clock, Washington Air Traffic Control cleared Flight 514 to descend further to 7,000 feet and instructed the crew to contact Dulles Approach Control. The captain contacted Dulles Approach and advised that the aircraft was descending through 10,000 feet on its way to 7,000 feet. The controller advised the crew to proceed to ARML and to expect to land on runway 12. So far, apart from the non-standard approach path, the aircraft was still flying safely. However, at 4 minutes past 11, the controller made a fateful transmission. He cleared the flight for an approach to runway 12. At this point, Captain Brock and First Officer Kessick made what would be the first of several unfortunate assumptions. These assumptions were based not only on past experience, but also on a document published years earlier by the FAA and then, unbeknownst to the crew, quietly removed a few years later. In this document, an airman's manual, the FAA had stated that a crew should descend to the approach altitude as soon as possible after receiving an approach clearance. The approach altitude from Round Hill was 1,800 feet, as stated on the approach panel, so according to this FAA document, the crew were now permitted to descend to that altitude. However, this guidance made no sense given the aircraft's current position. It was still miles away from the Round Hill beacon in an area where the minimum safe altitude was at least 3,400 feet. To make matters worse, another false assumption had now entered the equation. As far as the pilots were aware, this ATC clearance meant that they were under radar control and could continue the approach under the watchful eye of the controller. The pilots believed that if they descended below the minimum safe sector altitude, the controller would immediately inform them of this fact. However, despite what the pilots believed, the controller was not legally obliged to provide a radar service. It was entirely up to him whether he did so or not. And on that day, when the Dulles controller cleared Flight 514 for final approach to runway 12, he believed that he was not providing radar guidance, and therefore the crew was responsible not only for their own navigation to the runway, but also for their own terrain separation. So we had a situation where the pilots thought they were being monitored on radar, but the controller was not. But what about the approach charts that said the minimum safe altitude for that sector was 3,400 feet? It was common knowledge among pilots that when controllers were providing radar guidance, they sometimes allowed pilots to fly below the minimum descent altitude shown on the crew's charts. This was because controllers used their own set of minimums, which differed from those used by pilots. As a result, pilots became accustomed to controllers sending them below the official minimums and began to rely less and less on their own approach plates to ensure terrain avoidance. All this meant that on that cold December day over Washington, when the controller cleared Flight 514 for approach without giving any further instructions, Captain Brock interpreted this to mean that there were no obstacles between his current position and the airport. Neither the pilots nor the controller understood what the other was planning or thinking. This breakdown in communication was about to have a devastating effect on the crew's ability to navigate and even to fly. As soon as the controller cleared the flight for approach, the captain said to his two other crew members, 1,800 as the bottom, meaning that they could now descend to 1,800 feet, the altitude at which the final approach fix was made. The first officer replied, "Start descending." But the flight engineer wasn't so sure. The aircraft was still many miles from the runway. There was no need to descend so soon, and without any of the approach routes on their charts, they didn't know where the terrain was around them. He expressed his concern to the pilots, saying they were still, quote, quite a way out here. This was the first hint of doubt shown by any of the crew. However, instead of addressing this doubt in a more pointed way, He followed it up with a comment about the need to adjust the air conditioning on the plane. Doubt had now quietly crept into the cockpit. In the cabin, the passengers were completely unaware of what was happening in the cockpit. The plane had descended into a thick layer of cloud in which it would remain until moments before landing. Looking out the window, the passengers had little idea where they were or how high they were above the ground. Ironically, the same could be said of the pilots. As the plane descended, it encountered severe turbulence, so strong, in fact, that the first officer complained that his altimeter needle was jumping around. For a few moments, the pilots became fixated on the turbulence, which in reality was nothing more than a nuisance. The real danger to the flight was the pilots' lack of awareness that they were about to descend unknowingly below the peaks of the surrounding hills and mountains. At 7 minutes past 11, as Flight 514 descended towards 1,800 feet, Captain Brock, once again, he took the opportunity to study the approach chart a little more closely. The fact that he did so was perhaps further evidence that there was doubt in the cockpit, and not just in the mind of the flight engineer. Regardless of air traffic control clearances, it is always the captain's responsibility to fly the aircraft safely, and so Brock's second look at the chart came as something of a surprise. He saw that the minimum descent altitude between Front Royal and Round Hill was 3,400 feet. This was well above the 1,800 feet he thought it was safe to descend to. Brock remarked to his crew that this dumb sheet says it's 3,400 feet. Round Hill is our minimum altitude. The flight engineer had also missed this vital piece of information and asked the captain where on the chart he was referring to. At this point, alarm bells should have been ringing loudly in the ears of the crew. If the minimum altitude just a few miles south of their current position was 3,400 feet, why were they descending to just 1,800 feet? But if these alarm bells were ringing, they weren't ringing for long, for what followed was not a careful study of the charts and mapping the aircraft's position onto them, but rather a collective effort to justify the course of action the crew had already taken. After Brock had shown the other pilots that the minimum altitude a few miles to the south was 3,400 feet, First Officer Kresick challenged that fact, saying, "If he clears you, that means you can go to your initial approach altitude." Brock said this was a reference to the FAA document which said exactly that, but regardless of any documents, the pilots were now in a situation where there was serious doubt as to the correct altitude at which to fly, so there should have been no doubt about what to do next. Safran then confirmed that the aircraft was still descending and was now below the safe altitude of 3,400 feet. The sad reality was that the navigate part of aviate, navigate, communicate had been all but forgotten. The pilot's charts clearly showed mountains rising to 1,930 feet and 1,764 feet on either side of their course, yet the crew decided to continue their descent. They were now putting their faith and the lives of the passengers in the hands of the non-existent radar control. The crew had now fully succumbed to the psychological phenomenon known as confirmation bias. This is the tendency to seek out, interpret, and favor information that confirms pre-existing beliefs. In this case, the crew ignored all information suggesting that they should climb to a safe altitude and instead focused only on information supporting a descent to 1,800 feet. All it would have taken to rectify this situation was a radio call to air traffic control to confirm the minimum altitude, but the crew never did. But before we focus too much on this crew, it's worth remembering that this was far from the first time a flight crew had found themselves in this position on a flight into Dulles. Just a few weeks earlier, the crew of a United Airlines flight had found themselves in an almost identical situation as they approached the airport. They had also descended below the minimum safe altitude on their approach to Dulles after being cleared for approach while still 25 nautical miles from the airport. Just like the crew of Flight 514, this crew had failed to ask air traffic control if they were under positive radar control. This time, fate was on the crew's side. They narrowly avoided hitting Mount Weather on their final approach to the airport. Immediately after this incident, United Airlines conducted a review and found that several pilots were routinely descending below minimum descent altitude after receiving early approach clearance. The airline immediately informed its crew that they were required to maintain the minimum altitude unless they had confirmed with air traffic control that the aircraft was under positive radar control. Unfortunately, United Airlines didn't see fit to inform the FAA of this incident. This oversight deprived other airlines of the opportunity to gain valuable insight into this serious hazard. But the situation at Dulles was so bad that we don't even have to go back weeks to find more such incidents. Just 30 minutes before Flight 514 began its approach, an American Airlines Boeing 727 was cleared to land on runway 12, again without a minimum altitude requirement. The crew of this aircraft immediately contacted air traffic control to clarify whether they could descend to 1,800 feet before the final approach fix. The controller said they could not. All the crew of Flight 514 had to do was ask. Unfortunately, they were not on the same radio frequency at the time of the transmission. As so often happened that day, they narrowly missed an opportunity to clear up their misunderstanding. Rain and snow now enveloped the aircraft as it continued its descent. Finally, the crew's navigation instruments informed them that they had now reached the 300-degree radial from ARML. They began to turn right to intercept the runway. In just a few minutes, the flight would land. To be fair to all the crews involved, this was more than just negligence or complacency. The design of the approach plates made it difficult to see that they were at the wrong altitude. Their approach plate showed only the profile view of the approach from the final approach fix, just 6 miles from the runway, where the minimum altitude was 1,800 feet. Any pilot who was distracted, in a hurry, or unfamiliar with the airport could easily conclude that the minimum altitude was 1,800 feet for a much larger part of the approach. Again, apparently fixated on the turbulence, the first officer commented on how dark it was inside the cloud and how bumpy it was getting. Captain Brock looked out of his side window and caught a glimpse of the ground below the aircraft. The flight engineer did the same, catching a glimpse of the ground for a few moments before it disappeared beneath the cloud. They hoped to break out of the cloud soon. When they did, they would have the final, undeniable sign that they were flying headlong into danger. Ahead of the pilots, hidden by the cloud, was the solid wall of rock that was Mount Weather. The crew was hurtling towards it at over 400 kilometers per hour. The turbulence worsened and the plane dropped to 1,700 feet. Realizing this, Kesich said, "Power on," and pushed the throttles forward. Buffeted by the turbulence, the crew began to lose all situational awareness. The first officer struggled to keep the plane on course, reassuring the other pilots that he was on course. Of course, laterally the flight was on course. The runway was straight ahead. But vertically it was a full 1,600 feet below where it should have been. Moments later, the flight hit another wall of turbulence. From behind the two pilots, Saffron had commented, "Hang in there, boy. We're getting seasick." "Must have had a hell of a downdraft," said the first officer. The passengers were getting nervous, but for all the wrong reasons. Turbulence was not the problem. At 21:11, the pilots received the first warning that the aircraft was dangerously close to the ground. The radio altimeter was beeping, indicating that the aircraft was only 500 feet above the ground. The crew should have been able to see from the rangefinder that they were still a full 17 nautical miles from the airport, nowhere near the final approach fix. Normally, the pilots would not have expected to be at 500 feet until 1 or 2 miles from the runway. Now there was no way to ignore it. Something was seriously wrong. Captain Brock ordered the first officer to apply full power. Kresick pushed the throttles fully forward, drawing maximum thrust from the 3 engines. A few seconds later, the radio altimeter chimed again. This time the message was dire. The aircraft was now just 100 feet above the ground. Less than 2 seconds later, the aircraft slammed into the mountain. The plane skimmed the trees near the top of Mount Weather at an altitude of 1,670 feet. Moments later, the plane slammed into the mountain. It immediately burst into flames, and its momentum sent pieces of the fuselage flying over the top of the mountain. There was little left of the plane after the impact. None of the 92 passengers and crew survived. Immediately after the crash, the National Transportation Safety Board began one of the most important investigations in its history. The first major improvement that resulted from the accident was that the aviation industry focused on creating a common lexicon to eliminate confusion over terminology in the exchanges between pilots and air traffic controllers. Never again could such a simple misunderstanding have such devastating consequences. But the two most important changes to come out of that accident had little to do with communication. They were technological, and I've already mentioned one of them in passing earlier in this episode. These two innovations would forever improve the safety of passengers and crews around the world and make accidents like this almost entirely a thing of the past. Shortly after the crash of Flight 514, the NTSB asked the FAA to require all commercial aircraft to be equipped with a GPWS, or ground proximity warning system. This would give the crew a clear warning that they were rapidly approaching the ground and that they needed to take immediate action to save the aircraft. GPWS gives pilots significantly more warning time than the simpler systems of the past and has saved countless passenger lives in the years since its introduction. Another improvement, much of it the result of this accident, was an alert system for air traffic controllers that alerts them when an aircraft falls below the minimum safe altitude for a particular sector. Finally, in the wake of the crash, a nationwide reporting system was set up to allow pilots to report any incidents without fear of retribution. Sadly, it took the death of everyone on board TWA Flight 514 to make these changes a reality. But all of us who fly today owe our safety to accidents like this.